email has become the primary mode of communication in many businesses, and for good reasons. First, email is incredibly convenient. If you don't have an email address, you're at a real disadvantage, and for this reason, most companies now provide their employees with email addresses so they can be reached via this medium. Second, email is incredibly inexpensive compared to the cost of letters, memos, and other pre-electronic media forms of communication. Email is incredibly inexpensive. Third, it's really efficient. Email provides users with a number of advantages over the other forms of communication that it has largely displaced. You're able to review messages at your leisure. You can save messages for as long as you like without having a cluttered, messy office. And messages can be transmitted to as many recipients as you like with almost no additional effort. Finally, email is private. Typically, email accounts are secured with passwords or are viewed on individual devices. So, private communications that are sometimes the cornerstone of business are less likely to be read by parties that shouldn't be reading those messages when sent via email compared to more traditional paper-based media. In this video, we're going to discuss the basic components of a professional email message and talk about how to avoid common mistakes that people make when using email in a professional environment. Let's start by discussing the basic components of an email message. First, every email message should have 5 essential components, particularly when used in a professional setting. The first is recipients. You must specify who the message should be delivered to. Second, you need a subject. What is the subject of the message that you are sending? Third, a salutation, a basic greeting to the person or people who will receive the message. Fourth, you need the body of the message. What is it exactly that you're trying to communicate? And finally, you need some kind of close that ends the message and often signs with your name so that people know who the message is coming from. We're going to walk through each of these components and discuss their role in effective business communication. Let's start with the recipients fields. Both web-based and email clients contain a number of options for the recipients of a message. To, CC, which used to stand for carbon copy, but in the electronic age is more commonly referred to as courtesy copy, and then BCC, which again used to stand for blind carbon copy, but today, since we're not using paper and carbon paper to make copies of messages, is more commonly referred to as blind courtesy copy, are the 3 options for adding your recipients to an email message. In the To field, recipients whose email addresses are listed here will be able to see the other people to whom the message is addressed, as well as those who received a courtesy copy. And typically, when you send a message to someone and they are listed in the To field, you do expect them to respond to the message in some way. Second, the CC, courtesy copy field, is used to inform people who maybe aren't centrally related to the message, but should be informed of the content of the message, what's happening in your communication between yourself and the people in the To field. Again, the people in the CC field can see everyone who received the message, whether they were listed in the To or in the CC field. And finally, there is the BCC, or blind courtesy copy field. Recipients whose addresses are added to this field will be able to see everyone who the message was sent to using the To field, everyone who the message was sent to using the CC field. This allows you to send a blind copy of the message to people who might be interested in the contents of the message or the discussion that's happening, but those who you don't want people in the To or CC field to know are receiving the message. Typically, BCC should be used sparingly. although there are some exceptions. If you're sending an email to a large group of people and you want those people to remain private, not necessarily for everyone on the list to know that they are all receiving the same message, you can use the BCC field to accomplish this task. As with the CC field, those who are blind courtesy copied on any given message are typically not expected to respond. The subject line of a message gives you the chance to let your reader know what the basic topic you are covering in the message is. Typically, the subject line should be short and it should be very specific. So, for example, it's never a good idea just to leave the subject line blank. It makes it very difficult for people to find that message later when they need to refer to it. Similarly, you should generally avoid single or 2 to 3 word subject lines because they're simply not specific enough. So, for example, filming, not a very specific subject. Avoid that sort of thing. Next, something like filming at UD. We're getting closer to the level of specificity that you should see in a professional business message, but we're still not there. Next, we might look at something like filming mock interviews at UD. This is getting really close to the level of specificity that you want to try and use in the subject line of a professional email message. Even better might be something like filming mock interviews at University of Dallas on a certain date. This provides the reader with a very specific idea of the content of the message that you will be sending to them. And it allows them to go back later and find the message just by looking through the subject. So whenever you send an email message in a professional or academic environment, try to make the subject line as specific and detailed as possible. Next, the salutation of a message should be adapted to reflect the level of familiarity or formality that is present in the relationship. Typically, the salutation should be more formal earlier on in your relationship with an individual. So, for example, the first email message that you send a person, particularly if you've never met them in person, should typically be addressed with a more formal title. For example, Dear Mr. Anderson, or the title of the person, Director Anderson, Mr. Anderson, Dear Michael. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or greetings might be used in cases where you don't know the actual name of the recipient but want to maintain a level of formality. In subsequent messages, or for people that you know on a more than casual basis, you might choose to forego that level of formality and use their first name, Hi Mike, or just Mike, or Hello Mike, or Michael with no formal salutation. It is inappropriate typically to not have a salutation at all, or to use things like hey, or to misspell the person's name. That's always bad form. Yo, hello, hi, without a corresponding name is typically not looked upon favorably in a business environment. Typically, salutations are followed by either a comma or a colon. The comma is typically seen as a little less formal, but either are acceptable in most situations. You may choose to omit the salutation in more informal contexts when you are replying to a message. New messages, however, should always include a salutation. The email message body, like most business communication messages, should be clear, specific, and concise. Make sure you are using economy of language as you prepare and deliver your messages. One guiding principle that I use in all of my email communication is this: never write 3 sentences when 2 sentences will do. And you can simplify that even further. Never write 2 sentences when 1 sentence will do. The final component of any professional email message is the close. And similar to the salutation, it should reflect the appropriate level of familiarity or formality with that person who is receiving the message. So, for example, formal closes might be thank you, sincerely, regards, best wishes, cordially, or respectfully. More informal things might be the omission of the close altogether and simply writing your name. Cheers, thanks, adios. Probably not in a business communication situation, but love indicates a level of familiarity. In a business context, some inappropriate closes might be TTFN, BFN, bye-bye, see you later alligator, or ciao baby. All of those, while perfectly acceptable in interpersonal communications with your friends and family, should be left out of the business communication environment. After your close, you should always sign your name. And you can do this either with your name alone, or many people prefer to use a signature block that not only provides their name, but also relevant contact information, titles, and sometimes even quick links. You can see in my signature block right here that not only do I have my name, I also have the highest degree that I was awarded, my title and position within the University of Dallas, as well as my office phone number, my cell phone number, and a link to my website and a link to schedule a visit to my office hours. All of these are commonly requested pieces of information, and so by including them in my signature block, I make sure that anyone who receives a message from me has those essential pieces of information. Well, hopefully you have a good understanding now of the key components of any professional business message. Let's now turn our attention to some common mistakes and blunders that people make when using email in a professional context. The first one is the use of the reply button when starting a new message topic. One thing that I see quite often with people who use web-based email is a tendency to reply to the last message you received from a person, even when starting a new topic. Certainly, it's convenient to find the last email you sent to a person and simply reply to it rather than looking the person's address up in your address book, but this violates expectations about message content. And for people who use a threaded view in their email, it creates a jumbled mess of messages that have nothing to do with the subject. So if you choose to use that shortcut and reply to a previous message, even when you're starting a new topic, be sure that you change the subject line of the message before you send it. And it's a good idea to delete any previous message that may be quoted, because otherwise you're simply sending irrelevant text at the bottom of your message. So the principle here is make sure that the content of your message matches the subject line. If you start a new topic, start a new message, or at least erase the subject line from the old message. The second thing that I see quite often, particularly with students and young professionals, is a tendency to introduce themselves in messages to an unfamiliar person. And while this is an appropriate way to interact in meet space, it's not really a great way to interact in cyberspace, because you're really just duplicating information that already appears in your close or your signature block. So rather than starting a message with something like, "My name is Robert Yale and I'm an assistant professor of marketing at University of Dallas," instead, just rely on the person's ability to read their way to the end of the message, where they'll see who you are and the organization that you are affiliated with. Next, I often see a lot of messages that for some reason are not formatted appropriately, even in a business context. It's really important that you use white space to break up the text components of a professional message and to format your message for easy reading. You can see that this version of the message is much easier to follow than the previous one where all of the text was in a single line. Break up the key ideas of your message into paragraphs separated by white space so that the recipient or recipients of your message have an easier time following the message organization and breaking up the chunks of your text message. Finally, and I cannot emphasize this often enough, it is really important that you proofread your email messages before you click the send button. Nothing can reduce your credibility in a business context more quickly than email messages that are written with typos, grammatical mistakes, and formatting errors. So if you see that red underline, be sure that you check to make sure that you spelled the word properly. And beyond that, read through your message one last time before you ever click send to make sure you're not missing words or have made grammatical mistakes in your message. Your future self will thank you for not limiting your potential as a business professional by giving others around you the impression that you are sloppy, careless, or just an idiot. Hopefully, everything that we've talked about today has been a review. If it wasn't, I hope that the guidelines we discussed are helpful as you work to improve the professionalism of your email communication.